Chapter 2 Fiddle Music. It was to other shipwrecks at other times on the island that the talk had now turned, and after a while of this, Peter rose to take down a violin that was hanging on the wall. "We're great folk to play the fiddle here, as maybe you've heard tell," he said to Finlayson. "Indeed, there's hardly a house in these islands without a fiddle in it, and hardly a family without someone who can knock out a tune. But there's one tune we never play, except the mourn the death of one of our fisher lads. And so it's fitting now, it seems to me, that I should play it for your dead mates." Tucking his fiddle under his chin then, Peter played the morning song of the Shetland fishermen, and the rest of the family listened to it with tears not far away, for nothing can sing sweeter than a violin, and no music could have been sadder than this lament for drowned men. There was no telling what Finlayson thought of it, however, for he sat with one hand over his face all the time Peter was playing, and everyone had too much respect for his feelings to guess what expression he might be hiding. Old Da was ready with the right words, nevertheless, once the music was finished, and Peter was hanging the fiddle back in its place. "That was well done, Peter," said he. "The souls of those poor fellows will rest easier for it, and as for their bodies, we will give them decent burials when the time comes." Finlayson looked up at these words. "How will you do that?" he asked curiously, and old Da explained. "Well, the bodies will drift ashore sooner or later, and then we'll bury them just above high water mark at the place where they're found, for it's our custom, you know, never to take far from the sea anything the sea has claimed for its own." "A wise custom," said Finlayson, and smiled again, in the way that Robbie found rather odd. Then, with a glance at the various bits of farming gear in the room, he asked, "But you are farmers too, as well as fishermen, are you not?" "You could say that, I suppose," Peter agreed. "Everybody here has a wee bit of land we call a croft, and between that and the fishing, we manage to make some sort of a living." "Ach, Peter," Janet protested. "It's not such a bad living as all that." "No, indeed, it's not all hard work for us here," old assured Finlayson. And with this to start it off, the talk was soon flowing with stories of life on the islands, for the butt end was now all set for this kind of talk. The fire was red and cheerful. The only other light in the room was the gentle glow from the little lamp filled with fish oil, a collie, as it was called. Moreover, the hour was just right for storytelling, and Finlayson was always ready with a question of the kind that would start yet another story. So, the time ran on that night without any of the Hendersons realizing how neatly all these questions were putting a stop to the ones they might have been asking him. The grandfather clock in the butt end chimed midnight. Everyone suddenly realized how late it was, and with their eyes on the clock, Janet reminded them, "We have an early rise tomorrow." The rest of the family knew what she meant by this, for those were hard times when the salvage off a wreck was precious, and they would all have to be down at the Voe to get what they could from the Bergen. They could take the hint to rise, therefore, and Janet waved Finlayson towards the wooden settle standing against one wall of the room. "You can take the blanket I gave you and sleep there on the resting chair," said she, and then steered Elspeth ahead of her into the bedroom. Old Da followed in a minute or so. Robbie and Peter stayed to bank down the fire for the night and to put out the collie, and it was then, with his finger reaching up to close on the wick of the collie, that Robbie noticed Tam creeping back to his usual place by the fire. "You'll not mind old Tam, will you?" he asked. "He's not fierce, really, just a bit upset by everything tonight." Finlayson stretched out on the resting chair and pulled the blanket close around himself. One eye gleamed at Robbie over the edge of the blanket, a bright and somehow very watchful eye. A voice came, muffled by the blanket's folds. "Off you go, lad," said the voice. "I'll know how to calm your dog if he snarls again." Still Robbie hesitated, for there was something he did not like about the tone of the muffled voice. His father only laughed at it, however, and reached over Robbie's head to snuff out the collie. "Aye, surely," he agreed as he did this. Then, with a good night to Finlayson from both him and Robbie, they went to bed for their beds. There were proper old-fashioned Shetland beds, these, made like a large box complete with a lid on top and a sliding door on one side. There were air holes in the sliding doors, neatly pierced in the shape of hearts and diamonds. The box beds themselves stood on legs that raised above the draughts, and there were 3 of them in the room. One for Peter and Janet, one for Elspeth, and one that Robbie shared with old Da. Robbie was dead tired by this time, and he lost not a moment in getting in beside old Da. Almost instantly then, he was asleep, for the bed was comfortable, and old Da had warmed it for him. But just as suddenly it seemed to him, he was awake again, wondering how long he had slept, and what had happened to wake him. There was no sound or movement in the bedroom, he realized. But there was a sound coming from somewhere, the sound of a fiddle, very softly played and near at hand. And for several startled moments he wondered, who on earth could be playing the fiddle at that hour of night? Robbie's surprise was soon over, however, and it was uneasiness that gripped him then, for by the end of those first few moments he had realized that the music was coming from the butt end of the house, where his father's fiddle hung, and yet his father was lying asleep in the box bed a few feet away from his own. The sliding door of this bed was open, and he could see his father there, which meant that the only person who could be playing the fiddle was the stranger, Finlayson. And why would he be doing that at such an hour? Moreover, Robbie thought, there was something very odd about the music itself, something very eerie and mysterious, for there was no tune to it, or nothing he could recognize as a tune at least. It was just like voices sliding up and down a scale, in fact, high voices, echoing very sad and sweet in some hollow place, and in spite of the warmth of the bed, the sound they made was beginning to send shivers up and down his back. Crouching lower into the warmth, Robbie tried not to hear the voices, but he was curious about them, as well as uneasy. Besides which, he told himself, Finlayson had no right to be playing his Da's fiddle, and he had a good mind to say so to his very face. This was the very thought to give his curiosity the spur it needed, and gaining courage from it, he slipped cautiously out of the bed. A draught of cold air blew around his bare legs. The floor of the bedroom was cold, too, for it was only beaten earth, hard-packed and polished from the many years of use. With his toes curling away from the feel of this floor, Robbie padded to the door of the bedroom. For a moment he stood there, shivering as much from the cold now as from uneasiness. Then, carefully, he advanced a hand to the doorknob. The noise of Tam growling began to sound through the music, and instantly on this it stopped. Tam's growls grew louder, then began to die again, and tightening his grasp on the knob, Robbie pulled the door open far enough to allow him to see into the butt end. It was a room full of strange shapes and shadows that met his eyes, for the fire was still sending out a red glow that lit some things and left others in darkness. Even though he saw that his father's fiddle was gone from its usual place on the wall, and there was no form stretched out under the blanket on the resting chair. The fiddle now lay on top of this blanket, as if Finlayson had hurriedly placed it there, and Finlayson himself was kneeling on one knee in front of the fire, with Tam crouching in front of him. The dog's back was towards Robbie, but both dog and man were lit by the fire's glow, and Robbie saw that Finlayson had his hand cupped lightly around Tam's head. His eyes were fixed on Tam's eyes, and it seemed to Robbie that he was commanding Tam to silence with his stare. It struck Robbie, too, that Tam was afraid of the look holding him there, as well as fascinated by it, for the dog was shivering all over its body. Lower and lower it crouched, its eyes never leaving Finn Learson's eyes, its growl fading with every second of the look, until finally it was altogether silent. Finn Learson drew his hands away from its head, and in that moment he looked up, straight into Robbie's eyes. The firelight fell on his face, making a gleaming red mask of it in the surrounding dusk. His great dark eyes seemed bigger and darker than ever in that red mask, and the effect of all this sent a stab of fear through Robbie. Everything he had meant to say fled from his mind then, and all he could think of was getting back to his safe, warm bed. Stepping backwards, he began gently to close the door, and as he did so, Finn Learson rose to his feet. Robbie's heart quickened its beat still further, but he continued with his gentle closing of the door, and the last thing he saw in the last inch of its closing was Tam, still staring up in fascination at the man in front of him. Quickly and silently then, Robbie dashed for his bed, and creeping into it, he lay wondering about everything that had happened. It was very late at night by this time, however, and he was still tired. Also, it was very cozy, lying there in the warmth beside old Da. Robbie soon found he was too drowsy to keep thinking properly, and promising himself he would work out all of the whys and wherefores of it in the morning, he drifted off to sleep again.